Well, Monday and essentially the rest of the week marks a significant milestone in Africa's efforts to combat climate change. Governments, private companies, civil society, philanthropic organizations, and local communities from across the continent and the world will all converge right here at the Kenyatta International Convention Center to primarily discuss two things: how to promote green growth and climate finance solutions for Africa and the rest of the world. It is also an opportunity for Africa to speak with one voice in establishing targets and deadlines. And this is especially critical ahead of COP28 in November. Well, joining us now on set is a brilliant panel of climate change minds. Joining us, Jeff.
Indeed, and joining us is, first up, right next to me, Joseph Murabula. He's the CEO of Kenya Climate Innovation Center. Right next to him, Dr. Sheila Ochugboju. She's Executive Director of Alliance for Science. Right next to her, Dr. David Otieno Ngira, Regional Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Researcher at Amnesty International. And on the very far end, James Mwangi. Yes, the other James Mwangi. He's the Chief Executive Officer, Africa Climate Ventures, and founder of CAP-A. Welcome back, folks. Dr. Sheila, once again, look, this climate summit is very important, leading into COP28.
It is.
And there's been COP after COP after COP after COP. Does Africa have much to celebrate going into COP28?
Well, I think Africa, perhaps let's not call it celebration. It's an inflection point. We're getting to the midpoint of the SDGs. It's the global stock take. It's time for us to pause and say, what have we done? And there's some things that we can be proud of. Kenya particularly, 25% of the carbon credits across Africa have come to Kenya. And Kenya is doing so well in renewables that it's actually a showcase for the rest of Africa to see it's possible that 92% of your energy can come from renewables. And the first green bonds came from Kenya. So there are milestones which are significant. The question is, Africa is a big continent. How can we learn from each other? How can we do it faster, better? Because there is no time to lose.
And hopefully the summit helps us do that as we go in the next couple of days. But let me come to you, David, from a human rights perspective. Does the continent have anything to celebrate when it comes to climate change?
I think the increasing climate change over time has devastated the continent more and more. And we have a situation where most of our resources and budgets are now going to climate change adaptation. And that's why we've had to reallocate budgets. Countries have had to reallocate budgets to deal with matters of climate change. Countries have had to take loans to deal with matters of climate change. And so from a human rights perspective, I think there is still much to be done, because the promises that have been made by the international community as regards adaptation have not been met. And so as a consequence, the region, especially this Eastern African region, the Sahel region and the Southern African region, continues to suffer immensely as a result of deteriorating climate situations.
So let me ask you this. Africa has been disproportionately hit by climate change. Should the larger country, the emitters, do we require compensation?
Jeff, that's a very important question, and it's a question I think that most of the COPs have tried to tackle. And what generally happens is, because of the way the narrative is framed, there's then an us versus them sort of narrative, where the people in the developed world look at the situation and say, yes, fine, we need to do something, but we don't have to do it at zero option. And so, in my own view, the Africa is due compensation for the basic reason that we contribute very, very little towards climate change. I think the last time I looked at the numbers, we were talking about just 4% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, secondly, because we emit that little, but we are also the most affected, because we are also the continent that mostly relies on natural resources, and those are the sector that's most hit by climate change. And we also know that despite what you do in terms of adaptation or mitigation, there are certain climate impacts that are pervasive. It doesn't matter what you do, it will be there with you. And so for that reason, I think what is generally now known as loss and damage, which is basically compensating us for the risk, unavoidable risks of climate, I think is due. But it needs to be done within a framework that recognizes that the current decision makers in the countries that are said to have brought climate change were probably not there. Because climate change by itself is something that takes very, very long. I think we're probably talking about 30 years or so. Currently, most people think that the current impact we have probably came out of the second industrial revolution, somewhere in the 1930s and 1940s. So, and then a lot of those technologies were also we also benefited as a continent. So it needs to be done within a framework that recognizes all this. And I think that's why the Kenya government has decided that probably the best thing to do is to change strategy. Instead of going to the COP and saying, we demand that you do ABCD for us because of the climate change that you caused, then the narrative now is sit together around the table and say, fine, we understand it is climate change is here. The causes are known. The solutions are also known. How can we work together to be able to solve this sort of problem? So in that respect, then you sort of get compensation that is targeted, rather than compensation where you're basically given money and then you sort of decide what to do. Because if it is targeted, the chances are it will go to innovation. And as the person who runs Kenya Climate Innovation Centers, I see a lot of those new ideas, especially from very young people, university students, or people just immediately after university. I see a lot of innovations passing through my table, and it's my responsibility to figure out how to support them. So if we get this compensation that is then targeted towards supporting those innovations, then you are basically, I think, on the right path. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll be talking more about what those innovations actually are. Joseph, we'll come back to you. But James, this has been the hot topic literally every single COP. You talk about climate reparations. It's never enough money. Yeah. By 2030, you're talking about $6 trillion needed by developing countries. So even what's been committed so far is a drop in the ocean. So how does climate financing, for instance, and other initiatives help to remedy that issue of not enough money?
So I think the first step in this is recognizing that there's a lot of money needed to cope with climate change. Yeah. There's an even more massive amount of money currently being invested around the world in climate action. And what do I mean by climate action? It is all of the changes we're going to have to make as a human species in the way that we live and consume and operate if we are to survive this century. You can see it everywhere, right? 5 years ago, electric cars were a novelty, there were Teslas and this and that. Now, by 2035, most major automakers are saying they will make their last internal combustion engine car. We're moving to electric really fast. We're moving to renewables pretty fast, right? $150 billion invested in renewables in 2022. Actually, only 0.6% of that investment happened in Africa, despite Africa having 60%. Well, 60% of the best solar, 40% of the best renewables overall. So, in a sense, we need to say the world's economy is changing. What makes for a strong economy or a competitive position is also changing. And it's changing in ways that could favor Africa, right? The resources we have, the untapped renewable energy, and our young people are actually competitive advantages. And instead of, or in addition to reminding people of the reparations debt that they owe Africa, we need to not forget to tell a different story, which is a story that says if you're trying to avoid new emissions, to reduce emissions by cleaning up industry, or even removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere using nature or even using other techniques, Africa is the home of the biggest opportunity to do those industries. And so we then show up not with just a case, a moral case for why we should be compensated, but a business case for why we offer some of the best returns on investment in the world if you invest in our climate smart industry.
Yeah.
It's a new story.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. Dr. Sheila, let me ask you this real quick. Let's face it, women bear the greatest brunt of climate change.
Yes, they do.
Question is, are their interests being voiced?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, if you look at the SDGs, the one on gender equality, it is one of those that is lagging, and it would take us centuries to really catch up on gender equality. And it's lagging more and more because of climate impact. So really, when we talk about unlocking finance and climate finance, all these things are wonderful. Actually, the problem is not that there's not money. There's enough money. Yeah. The problem is, how is it distributed, and does it cascade down? Do the benefits cascade down to those that need it most? And so when we're talking about innovations and unlocking finance, we need to know how it will reach those on the ground and how transformative can it be. It can be. We can make it transformative. We have the capacity to do that. But perhaps what we need to do is not leave the definitions of what is needed to bankers, to financiers, to industry, to business. So even a simple thing like carbon credits. Who defined carbon credits? It's the businesses that define it. We don't, and then they tell us what price it is. Even if you look at something like affordable housing, say, who defines affordable? It's a bank. It's not us to say, really, how much do I have? What's affordable to me to build? So it's about, let's empower those at the grassroots to find a way to also draw down from these innovations that are transformative and will come out of this continent.
You know, David, recently Amnesty International released a press release asking African leaders to put human rights at the center of negotiations. What does that look like, essentially, and why does it matter now?
So we believe that Africa-centric negotiations would, for instance, address the question of just energy transition. Because we keep saying we need to use renewable energy, we need to use smart technology, but sometimes in the process of generating what we call smart technology, including, for example, minerals like copper and cobalt, you have whole families and communities evicted. And we've experienced this in the DRC, where families are evicted, schools are destroyed, communities are destroyed, because government has given concessions for people to mine cobalt, for people to mine copper. And the justification is it is being used for car batteries to power electric cars. The copper being used to make cables for electricity. And so DRC then positions itself as climate friendly while actually undertaking actions that violate human rights. But on this other side of ours, we've seen a situation where the international community has not been proactive in addressing the plight of climate migrants, especially in Eastern Africa, Southern Africa, and in the Sahel. And you've had these climate migrants moving all the way up to Europe, and being branded as boat people and other funny names. And the problem is that the international refugee law regime perceives you as a refugee only if you are escaping from some sort of physical persecution, either by the state or you feel some sort of physically unsafe. We have never revisited that understanding to address the question of those who feel unsafe because they no longer have food, they no longer have water, they no longer have livelihoods. So when these people migrate, we chase them away, we call them names, we brand them. Nobody wants to listen to them. And so that's why we are saying as Amnesty International that in our human rights sensitive climate response, we need to address this. Equally important, I think, is to address the question of debt, because we are pushing African countries to take debt to address climate. And they ended up in debt distress, and therefore having to take money from other sectors of the economy to pay back the debt. So we are saying that much as we are still waiting to have this loss and damage fund operationalized, we were told it would be operationalized by 2025, we need some sort of debt relief now so that African countries can begin to address the plights on the right to food, right to health, right to education, and so on.
Dr. David, real quick, for those who don't understand, you just call them climate migrants. Others call them climate refugees. What exactly are those?
So in legal terms, a refugee is a person who's escaped his country and crossed international borders and is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of his country. He would be running away from some sort of persecution by state or non-state agents. Now, climate migrants do not necessarily run from physical persecution. You realize that the river where you used to fetch water has dried, your farms have dried, so you don't have any source of food, so you decide to migrate. When you cross international border, you are told you are not a refugee, so we can't give you asylum. And then you are also not an IDP, right? So you've crossed international border, you are in some legally precarious situation. So what countries do is to send them back and say, we don't have a convention dealing with these climate migrants. So the term climate refugee is problematic for that reason, because of the way in which countries reject that categorization. So here in Africa, we have the Kampala Declaration that is meant to address internally people who've migrated internally. But we do not have one that deals with people who've migrated externally. And that's why we are saying we need to rethink the international legal framework on migration to find a way of protecting people who are migrating as a result of climate change.
James, let me bring you in here and talk a bit about energy transition. It's a bit of a controversial point here because there have been experts who say, should developed nations help Africa with that transition or allow Africa to use its existing fossil fuels as transitional energy to get into that green space? Where do you sit when it comes to that particular area?
I honestly sit with the numbers.
Okay.
And when you move away from emotion and sentiment and you say, let's compare the cost of actually exploring, damaging nature, exploiting fossil fuel reserves that haven't been exploited yet, versus the cost of installing clean, green energy, which is falling in price every year, right? Solar panels cost 10% of what they cost just 12 years ago, and they're not slowing down in the fall of their prices. It's already today cheaper to do a new build renewable energy project than to keep coal plants in most parts of the world running, if you have the sun. So in Africa, in most places, actually it's a false trade-off. Now, we may need some gas for base load. We may need something to keep the power on when nature is, or when renewables are fluctuating. That's a different conversation, and we should have it. But I think we should first of all not forget to play to our advantages. When we modeled it, we found that Africa could actually bring clean, green power to every citizen on the continent by 2030. Right, at a lower ongoing cost, because you know with renewables you pay a lot to begin with to install the solar or the wind or whatever, but then after that it comes free from the sky, right? Whereas you build a plant to run on fossil fuels, every day you have to pay. Now it's cheaper at the beginning, but in the long run it's a lot cheaper to go renewable, especially if you can then market yourself to the world by saying, don't just think of this as power for us to use with what we do today. Move the world's manufacturing to Africa because we have greener power. We have those young people who are moving in search of jobs, and we have the raw materials that you're processing anyway in other places. Instead of exporting raw cobalt, raw copper, let's actually industrialize and make the batteries and thus capture the value that allows us to increase our dignity and increase our economic power in this transformed economy.
So, Joseph, why aren't we making enough noise as what James is saying? How come we're not making that much noise?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think the world order, if I may call it that, is such that quite a lot of power in terms of financing is in the developed countries. That's where most of the money is sitting. And on this other side, while we bear the brand, we don't have as much. So the power balance is a bit of a problem in that respect. But I think that is also slowly changing, because I see quite a lot of African voice had in many places. And forums like this, the Africa Climate Summit, I think we lend to amplification of that voice. So part of what we expect is a fairly strong stand in terms of what we are going to do as the African continent in terms of the green transition, as James has spoken about, what we are going to do in terms of innovation, what we are going to do in terms of financing, and the reality is that since we have the natural resources, and increasingly we have the talent, lots of young people in this continent have the innovations and have the talent. Our voices will be heard, and quite a lot of people looking for opportunities will come to speak to us. And a very good example is just the number of people who have registered for this summit, for instance. I think I was involved in the initial conversations about planning, and I think everybody thought that if we got 10,000 people, we probably have done well. And that time, we were basically looking at our target being the African continent. But we know, as we speak now, that probably our registrations are closer to 20,000, number of people who've registered for this summit, and a significant number of those people are from outside the African continent. So I would say we've not been heard in the past. Our voice has not been as strong. But that we are increasingly becoming an attractive continent, and with that attraction, a lot more of our voice is going to be heard.
Good point.
We're getting ready to wrap up, and I want to kind of get a sentiment from all of you. I was listening to an international report the other day, and they called East Africa, or essentially the Horn of Africa, ground zero of climate change. We don't need to go far to see the effects of climate change, and that's the reality. And I really want to hear from all of you, as we consolidate one African voice in the next couple of days at the summit, what does Africa need to say at COP28? What needs to be that one resounding message that needs to come out from our leaders once they take whatever has been deliberated on here to Dubai in November? So
James, let's start with you and then come this way.
I'll put it very simply to the world. If you look at the numbers, if you look at what's coming out of the stock take in terms of how far behind we are in hitting our targets, if you look at what technologically needs to be done to get to net zero by 2050, there is no way for the world to get to net zero, which we all need, not just Africa. We all need it. The entire planet needs it. There's no way to do it without massively increasing investment in Africa. And I said investment for return, to build businesses, to create the jobs of the 21st century green economy.
Dr. David.
What we need to do, first of all, in the COP28 is to completely reject carbon trading, because we are being forced as Africa now to absorb, not necessarily forced, but manipulated. It's kind of another neocolonialism, where companies want to continue producing and polluting and manufacturing in the global north, then come and pay us to absorb their